Hello everyone, I'm Marty Owings. This is Capitol Conversations for February 19th, 2013. We're live here at the Capitol, and tonight I'm pleased to be joined by two guests here tonight. We've got Representative Pat Garofalo from Farmington, Minnesota, and he is a House Republican in his 7th term here at the legislature. Fifth term. Okay, I give you two extra
I look
terms.
like I've been in my 7th
well,
term.
it sometimes feels that way.
Yeah.
And Representative Ryan Winkler, who is a Democrat in his 4th term in the House of Representatives as well. And thank you both for joining us tonight. Well, as you know, the governor released his budget almost a month ago now, and it continues to get plenty of reaction up here. Representative Garofalo, I'm wondering if the GOP got an early version of the governor's budget even before the DFL?
I think we probably got it about the same time as the DFL, but no, obviously the governor's budget is preliminary. It's the first step in a multi-step process for the budgeting decisions we'll make this session. On February 28th, a new budget forecast will come out, and that'll show increases and declines in both revenues and expenditures, and they'll give us our final baseline. And then the governor will submit a supplementary budget. But obviously, it's been reported on quite a bit, but many concerns with the governor's budget. And as has been said before, the governor proposes, the legislature disposes, and so we'll see what measures in the governor's plans that the DFL legislature accepts.
Well, here's the reason I ask. Because when I went to the DFL to get their reaction, they said, hey, Marty, up and even to last week with the majority leader, look, the governor's budget was big. We haven't had a lot of time to study it all. There's a lot of details in there. We don't really want to talk too much specifics about some of the more controversial items, even though we pressed on those. But Pat Garofalo, Representative, you were way ahead of the curve because on the 25th, the governor released it on the 22nd, I think, 23rd maybe. On the 25th, you had already prepared this statement. It said Governor Dayton had failed Minnesota with his budget proposal. This budget fails middle-class families by raising taxes on medicine, childcare, haircuts, high school prom dresses, and tuxedos. So that's why I asked you if you'd seen the budget early, because your reaction was already queued up, it seemed like. And it was that.
No, well, I mean, we had a chance to, no one knew what the governor was going to propose, but the details of it, once they came out, were pretty quick.
Okay.
And so obviously the broadening of the sales tax, expanding it to many more things, raises a little bit over $5.5 billion over the next 4 years.
Right.
That's gotten a majority of the coverage, and candidly, I don't expect that to, I don't think that aspect of it's going to end up becoming law. There's just been such a universal opposition, and of course the Star Tribune, once they found out that they would have to pay the tax increase, they immediately came out against it. So
funny how that happened.
Yeah, we'll see how the other stuff, the clothing tax increase.
Right.
I think that it sounds like the DFL is looking at maybe an alcohol tax increase or maybe a little bit higher tobacco tax increase, in addition to the new 4th tier and income tax brackets, taking Minnesota to a 9.85% tax rate. But ultimately, all this stuff is entirely dependent upon the February forecast that comes out on the 28th. If the budget forecast shows an improvement and the projected deficit gets smaller, it requires less spending cuts and less tax increases than the governor proposed, although he didn't really propose any spending cuts. Conversely, if it gets worse, if the economy gets, if the budget forecast gets worse, that requires additional solution where either you have to curtail the new spending or you have to juice up the tax increases even bigger.
Well, I wanted to get to this, some of the specifics with you, Representative Winkler.
All right.
The DFL has gone away from some of the more controversial, not wanting to talk about some of these issues in specific, whether they support them or not. Are you willing to talk to those specifics, like let's say the $500 tax rebate or the business-to-business taxes?
Well, listen, you cannot take individual items in this budget and take them out and say, well, I don't like this, so therefore I don't like the whole budget. You have to look at the whole package put together. The governor raises revenue to create the first balanced budget that is honestly balanced in the last 10 years. He reforms the tax code significantly in a lot of ways that businesses have asked for and economists have asked for. He provides property tax relief to virtually every Minnesota homeowner and business owner. And he invests for the first time in education, especially in higher education and career training and early education, so that all kids have a chance to do well in school and have a great opportunity ahead of them. So the governor's framework of tax reform, an honestly balanced budget, property tax relief, and an investment in education are the key, I think, important priorities. We may disagree in the end on some of the details for doing that. The legislature may not have the courage that the governor has to promote a major tax reform effort. So when Pat talks about $5.3 billion tax increases and puppies, and I don't know, you even fell into this, I think, you know, talking about individual items, prom dresses, tuxedos, doing tax reform takes a little bit of guts, because you have to tax a lot of things that weren't taxed before in order to buy down tax rates for everybody. And so the question is, you know, will the legislature have that same level of courage that Mark Dayton has? And from my experience, legislatures are, you know, pretty wimpy on some of those things. And, you know, Pat's called it a failure, and in my experience on budgets, Republicans in government are experts on failure.
Before we get to your action, Representative Garofalo, the thing about the you know, K-12 stuff, right? No, what do you mean? He's not paying back the shifts. I mean, Representative Garofalo proposed a bill to do that, which seemed to get ignored. Well,
he proposed a bill that would partially pay back some of the shift, and the governor's budget will pay back the shift after the next 2 years. No shift has ever been paid back within the first 2 years. Certainly not a, you know, record-breaking, all-time, world's biggest school debt borrowing plan that the Republicans passed. So the fact that that would be paid back after 2 years is actually setting a record in Minnesota for things like this. So the governor's budget is very responsible. I don't think the governor promised to pay it back immediately. When we were running for the legislature, we said the school shift needs to be paid back. That might be a place where Democrats in the House are a little bit different from the governor. We may want to accelerate that, but the governor still pays it back.
Marty, here's the thing with the school shift is that the school shift basically takes money that schools are supposed to get in May and June, and it gives it to them in July and August. That's why school districts historically, they haven't really particularly cared about it, especially with low interest rates. It just hasn't mattered. Now, during this campaign, for the, you know, the shift was first used in the 1980s, and on a bipartisan basis, Democrat and Republican legislatures have passed it. Democrat and Republican governors have signed it. That's what's happened. The difference this year was that for the first time, it was actually used as a political weapon to give this false impression that somehow, despite the fact that Governor Dayton proposed the shift, you know, I was the chief author of the bill, so I have to take ownership of it. But it was the first time it was used as a political weapon. But the good news is that
that's not unprecedented around here.
Well, no, but I mean,
using stuff as political weapons.
Right, but I mean, the thing was, even even at a, you know, just a basic level of honesty. Again, Democrat and Republican legislatures, Democrat and Republican governors have signed it.
Yeah.
But the good news is that you're never going to see Republicans vote for it again, because that's been sort of demonized and politicized.
Right.
And so in terms of its impact on school districts, if you were to talk to school districts and you were to talk to sort of the system, they have no interest in Representative Winkler, me, or Governor Dayton paying back the shift. They don't want it. They want more money on the formula. And this is sort of that's a symptom of a bigger problem in education right now, and the education system is very good at looking out for its own needs, of protecting the interests of the adults. And from their perspective, paying back the shift, that doesn't mean more money on the contract. It doesn't mean more generous pensions or benefits for the adults. So they have no interest on it. They want more money going into the system.
I hadn't heard that, Representative Winkler. Your reaction to that?
Well, you can say that the school shift was used as a political weapon. Maybe it was more effective to get people to understand just how irresponsible the last budget was. And I think Pat and I would agree that even more irresponsible, even a greater failure in this last budget was tobacco debt, basically borrowing money against future revenue coming into the state. It was the first time in state history that we borrowed money to fund a deficit. And the fact is that is even more irresponsible than the school shift. And historically when we have borrowed money from schools to balance the budget, it has been a mix of revenue increases or tax increases, spending cuts, and shifts. In the last two budget cycles leading up to 2011, we did shift money and we did cut spending, but we didn't raise revenue. And that's why finally this year we need to raise revenue to correct all those problems, so that the third leg of the stool is actually on the stool instead of broken off and the stool is just laying on the ground. That's what the state budget is. It's in tatters on the floor, and it's time to fix it, and the Dayton plan does that.
But Marty, here's the problem with that. First of all, on the school shifts side of things, I mean, it's important to note, and I'm trying to lay out the fact for people that both sides have done this. It's not okay. So when I was in the minority and you were in the majority, Governor Pawlenty proposed a 20% increase in the shift, going from 10 to 20%, and your guys' response was to bump it up to 27%.
Well, after first trying to raise revenue as a third part of that,
No, actually, that was actually this part, Ryan, or Representative Winkler, sorry. part of your original opening offer was to take it to 27% to go higher than that. So whenever anyone talks about they're pure on the shift or they're against it, the reality is the establishment, the teachers union, the people who profit from the public education system, who are looking out for themselves, they could care less about the shift. They want more money going into the system. Now, in terms of
that's not. I mean, that's
no. I mean,
they care. They don't care as much as they care about having their basic funding formula at least be closer to inflationary levels.
Here's the thing.
What was the question?
Isn't it responsible government? I mean, you guys tried to reform, 2.0, get up and do a bunch of reforms that would correct these issues, and yet the issue remains persistent, and it's not as if it's gone away.
Marty,
both parties own it.
Here's the thing. In the 1970s, Minnesota's strategic plan was this. We said...
No, the Minnesota Miracle.
Well, the plan was this, that if you came to Minnesota, you're going to pay higher taxes on the front end. Your costs will be higher. But you know what? You're going to have such an insanely productive workforce and an educated workforce that in the long run, it's going to pay for itself.
Did it work?
And it did. And an emphasis on the past tense, Marty, it worked. Here's the problem. It's 2013. And you can tap in, businesses worldwide can tap into that insanely productive and educated workforce and get all the benefits of it. And because of digital technology and the internet and video conferencing, they don't have to pay for it, which is a real problem that doesn't really solve itself in 30 seconds or get put on a bumper sticker. So really the only solution that we can have is we have to try to keep costs at a manageable or reasonable level.
Why not just cut off the internet altogether?
Yeah, well, the real true solution is we have to manage costs at a reasonable level, and we have to outwork, out-hustle, and outperform the rest of the nation and the world. And that's not the kind of solution that fits into a 30-second commercial or onto a postcard. And so, you take a look at education right now. The governor is proposing basically a 2% increase above his budget. And it's a $1 billion increase over the previous session in terms of baseline budgeting. It's about $350 million.
Yeah, I looked at the numbers,
with very few examples, I mean, he's putting money into the early childhood scholarships. That's a good thing. But outside of that, we're not really doing anything new, and that's not really a plan that's going to
Well, here's the thing. You can't on one hand say the governor's budget is radically different from anything we've ever seen before. That's one GOP message I heard. And then on the other hand say, we don't see anything new. Let me ask you this, though. Shifting gears away from the K-12 stuff, no pun intended. I want to get to this, Representative Winkler, because this B2B taxes thing that's got people, I think, from both sides of the aisle talking, I mean, political aisle, not necessarily up here, about that as being, doesn't seem reasonable for our state to grow business friendly or just economically friendly. And then about this property tax rebate that treats a millionaire the same as it does a single mom on $30,000 a year.
Well, and the business-to-business tax, I mean, the governor's principle is quite simple, which is that if consumers are paying taxes on services, there's no reason that businesses should get a special exemption and not have to pay taxes on services. It falls in, he's countering this constant effort at the legislature and in politics. I think Reagan was very successful in only caring about the supply side of the economic equation, only caring about coddling and taking care of special business interests, instead of worrying about the economy as a whole, worrying about whether an average person working is able to earn enough money in order to pay for the goods and services that the businesses are offering. We've totally stepped aside from that. And so the governor's very simple idea is if consumers are paying it, businesses should pay it. Businesses will benefit from the lower rate. They buy a lot of goods, not just services. Businesses will get, most businesses will get a reduction in their corporate income tax. There is a mix of things that are happening here. And what we need to do is to make sure that we're looking at any kind of perverse outcomes that don't make sense. But the fact is, the basic idea of treating businesses no better than anybody else in the state of Minnesota is a pretty straightforward way of doing this. And if there are particularly horrible outcomes from taxing business services, we can address that. But that has to be taken in the context of all the benefits that businesses are getting and asking for. They're asking for a more educated workforce. They're through better investments in early childhood, in reform of the K-12 system, through expanding investment and reform in the higher ed system. They want those things, those public goods, to be provided. Increasingly, they're not even willing to do the training of their own workers. They're depending on the state to pick it up. They're asking workers who receive low wages to get food stamps from the public. They're depending on the rest of us picking up a big part of the tab, and then they complain when they're being asked to pay for part of it. So I think we do have to consider carefully the B2B tax, but not take that away from the overall budget that the governor has proposed and looking at the economy overall. If we try to just focus exclusively on consumers and not worry about what businesses are paying, we're just giving them a gift, and we have to be more careful than that.
Well, I think the business-to-business services portion of the tax increase is dead. It's not going to happen. There's universal opposition to it. Just from a tax planning perspective, nonpartisan planners would say that pyramiding, where you add additional costs as something moves through the pipeline. This is something that Michigan looked at doing. They passed it. 6 months later, they repealed it. So I'm not really worried about that portion of it becoming a law. That's not a concern. What I'm more concerned about is the structural balance aspect of it. Representative Winkler mentioned earlier.
That sounds technical. Please don't scare us.
Oh well, I mean, basically, just means that you want to balance things as much as you can in the future.
Okay, sure.
And the problem is the only way the governor is able to present a balanced budget is by assuming that he's going to freeze education funding and he's going to freeze local government aid. Those are two things he has promised he would never do. And so what we're really doing is we're setting ourselves up for a cycle that we've seen in many other states, and that is that you raise taxes and then spending ends up growing at a faster rate than personal income. And in that situation, the only solution, if you're not willing to cut spending, if you're not willing to keep a lid on the growth in spending to personal income growth.
He does not agree.
Well, no, but that's what it is that he's growing government spending faster than personal income growth.
That is not true. That is not true at all. If you look at the total amount of spending that people do on government, whether that is local property taxes, tuition paid to a public university, fees that you pay, special assessments on your streets, state taxes, including income tax, sales tax. If you look at all the money that Minnesotans pay for government in Minnesota, it is less under the Dayton budget than it was 2 years ago as a share of personal income.
You are making a different point, though. You're making a different point than me. What I'm saying
You're talking about the state budget. You're not looking at government as a whole.
What I'm saying is you cannot have government spending, whatever that number is, grow at a faster rate than personal income growth. Now, it is correct because of demographic changes in our state that you are seeing taxes as a percentage of overall income be lower on an aggregate basis. The problem is when you go into the future, you cannot have the spending at all units growing at a faster rate than personal income.
You can if your population is expanding to serve more people.
That's the problem. We don't have this. And historically, we could always rely on this massive migration of Wisconsin, Midwest states coming here, inflow migration. Not just in Minnesota, but nationwide. That's not happening anymore. Demographically, we're just not having as many kids as we used to.
Well,
we're not importing as many kids.
The number is the number. We are spending less as a share of our state's personal income now than we were 20 years ago by a long shot. The governor's budget keeps us on that path of spending less all the time. I actually think, if anything, the governor should raise less money to pay for tax reform and more money to pay for investments in education and things that are actually going to grow the economy. That's what we need to do. If you talk to any economist, we have to have the average worker be more productive, and that does not mean they've got to work longer hours to make less money. That's the Republican model. People work harder, make less money, and we hope that the blessings of global capitalism will rain down on us. But we don't have a plan to actually draw those investments here.
Can you write that down?
Well, the good news is with the Democrats in total control that we're going to see that plan, and you'll be able to take credit for it at the end of the session.
Hey,
I'm confident.
Beyond the blessings of global capitalism, I need to address some issues before we run out of time. Whatever they're dubbing last week, Gun Week or whatnot. A lot of talk about guns up here, and a lot of misinformation seems to be out in the public. I shudder to think how it got there, but let's just put it this way. You hear Republicans talk about the gun issue, and they use the word gun control, and the Democrats have rebranded that or talk about it as gun violence, and it's hard to keep up with which side's what, but I'm getting to my question here. Not just beyond those issues, it sounds like Senator Latz backed off the going after assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. I want to know first, how does that sit with you, Representative Winkler, and then Representative Garofalo? Is it an overreach to say we want background checks on people who have had a history of sort of mental illness and things like that? I mean, serious mental illness.
You want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I don't know what the specific bills. I don't know much about the bills that were actually offered. I do think you have to be careful about painting with a broad brush about semi-automatic rifles. I've owned a semi-automatic rifle since the day I was born, and my dad bought me a deer rifle that he then used for the first 14 years of my life. So it depends on what you're talking about. And in high-capacity magazines, you know, I'm not sure. If you're talking about people being able to fire off 100 rounds in 1 minute, you know, I think there's definitely space in our policy to say that those are not permissible. But
well, you
at the same time,
differentiate between a bazooka and a...
But at the same time, I'm not convinced that that kind of a ban is going to solve the problem either. I think a lot of our gun debate is kind of silly. We sort of have these emotional extremes yelling at each other, and nobody's really addressing the core issue, which, I mean, the fact of the matter is most gun violence is suicide. It's far more than homicide, and most homicide is handguns, and it's in you know, accidents and things like that. It is in the streets. It's not mass shootings. If we try to create a whole policy and a whole debate about mass shootings, we're missing a lot of ways that people die. And I think we can have a much better and much more sensible discussion about it.
Yeah, and the thing is that like many public policy issues, the
Surprised
public
you didn't take a tougher stand on this issue.
But the public's knowledge of this issue, there's a lot of people out there who've never owned a gun in their life. They haven't owned a rifle, like Representative Winkler and I have, and their knowledge of guns is limited to what they saw in the last action-adventure thriller they saw.
Exactly.
So I mean, the reality is automatic weapons are already illegal. The gun you described that fires off 100 rounds, that's
Representative Winkler.
That was mine.
Oh, look, that gun is already illegal. It's been illegal since the 1930s.
Yeah.
And so with regards to you know, mental illness, I think that the important thing is we don't want to be turning people like physicians' assistants and doctors who are diagnosing people.
That argument.
And so there's a lot of data privacy, you know, data practices and privacy issues have always been bipartisan in our state. And so this is not a matter of a gun issue. This is a data privacy issue where if somebody has a misdiagnosis at a physician's assistant in an emergency room on a Friday night, that they're prohibited from buying any sort of gun the rest of their life.
Is that how you got on that list?
Yeah.
There's breaking news.
I think you just put a Republican after my name, and that puts me on the list these days, right? So I mean, the thing is that with you know, guns, and again, Representative Winkler is totally right. I mean, handguns, the Second Amendment is pretty clear that you have a right to own a handgun, and the vast majority of handgun-related deaths are suicide and involving people who know each other who are in a fit of rage. And so that's...
In fairness to the issue, Representative Garofalo and Representative Winkler, at least one thing is right. I mean, the President recently said, we don't benefit from ignorance, talking about, you know, the NRA's lobby in Washington being able to shut down the studies that, you know, I mean, basically defunding the, you know, Centers for Disease Control of even studying the issue. I think that President Obama's responded, I think, to a lot of people's, in their minds, reasonably to that. We may not stipulate that, but at least can we look at the question? Can we look at the question of gun violence as it relates to these weapons that are being talked about?
But again, you know, in the state of Minnesota, right, more people died from fist fights than from rifles last year. I mean, that's just it's a documented fact. If the focus truly is on reducing gun violence, high magazine clips, these are feeding off the ignorance of the public. This is
you characterize it as fist fights versus rifles, but guns in general.
Right,
I mean,
but
far more people.
But we're talking about you know, and again,
but no one's talking about banning long rifles. That's what I'm talking about. The miscommunication.
Well,
with
and
the public.
I mean,
but that's what the point is that why are we having a conversation about banning? And we're using a fictitious term here, assault rifle. Why are we talking about banning certain type of rifles?
Well, no, it's not fictitious, though, Representative Garofalo, because I was in the military. I know what an assault rifle is versus a long rifle.
Well, no, but you understand that previously when they banned assault rifles, they banned guns not on what they did, but what they looked like. Now, what an absolute...
Yes, I understand that.
It's an
I understand that
policy.
subtlety, yes.
And so if the concern truly is about gun violence, and it's truly about safety, then have a factual debate about it. Talking about banning high-capacity magazines
I think that's what we're getting to.
And rifles, it doesn't do anything.
I mean, we have
have you advanced the argument up
well,
here
we've got we have a very volatile, very dynamic society, and we have a society where lots of guns are there. That is why, I think those are the two reasons why we have such a hugely disproportionate share of gun violence compared to the rest of the world.
Just because of the availability of guns?
Availability and the nature of our society. We're just we're dynamic, we're diverse, we are very much a freedom-loving society. And so I think those two things together. I have a bill, one of the gun bills, It's at the intersection of mental health and gun ownership. I think it could make a difference. But the one thing that I think is really good is the president's focus on this has at least opened a the space for a rational discussion about policies that would work. And my hope is that rather than doing simple things that sound good or feel good to some groups, we actually focus on policies that could work instead of just saying, well, we can't even talk about this issue at all. We should just, and we can't take any kind of action.
Well, and again, Marty, the Democrats have total control of our state. I mean, as much as I talk about it, I have no ability to stop anything that Democrats agree on. And so if additional gun restrictions are a priority for them, they're going to pass it and they're going to get it enacted into law.
Well, we're just going to wrap up here shortly, but last question. Okay, and this is something that came up earlier in the week, and it's been a point of contention up here. Rules changes.
Yeah.
I know that. Any tweets first before we do? Is it not from Rukavina to him? Is it? 'Cause I don't want to go through that again.
No, we actually have a question from J.T. Farnsworth to Representative Garofalo. Where does he see compromise opportunities with DFLers related to Second Amendment issues? So it's sort of already what you guys are talking about.
Sure. I mean, for me, there are certain issues that we can work out and find a common ground on. For me, I'm opposed to additional restrictions on the Second Amendment. I mean, if you look in the state of Minnesota, those communities that have the highest per capita rates of handgun ownership actually have lower crime rates. Now, I understand why higher handgun ownership in Minneapolis and St. Paul may not work for the legislators from those districts. I understand that.
Yeah.
But for many of us from rural areas in greater Minnesota, we have handguns everywhere. We have lower crime rates. The problem is not the gun. That's not the issue. The problem is the education level and the experience of those individuals. So for me, if you want to truly solve the problem, additional gun restrictions have no role in that process.
Very good. Well, let's go to the rules changes.
Yeah.
Representative Winkler, why poke the bear? I mean, every time we have this go on, and I think that you were one of the ones that stood up when Republicans tried to change some rules about debate. I mean, I think Marty, what is it, Leader Seifert was involved in this conversation about rules changes back a couple legislative sessions ago, changing the rules on amendments.
Did we change the rules at all? I don't think we did.
Well, there was discussion. There was discussion, and but it always comes up, and it seems you know, we mentioned the words capricious and arbitrary to change the rules like that to disallow amendments on the floor.
But that isn't all.
Okay,
I think the
maybe
best.
there's some
I think
misinformation.
my short description of the rule change is the tyranny of the joyless trampling on the rights of the unprepared. I mean, the worst thing that the rule change does is to take away some of the spontaneity and fun out of the out of a legislative session. The best thing that it does is make people to actually work on their amendments 24 hours ahead of time. So no amendments are limited. 160 of them were pre-filed yesterday. I don't know, 5, 6, 7 at the most were actually taken up and voted on. The Democrats are not afraid of debate. And there's nothing in the rules that in any way limit debate, except unless you can't come up with an amendment at least 24 hours before you're actually debating the bill.
Why change the rules?
Here's the reason why they did it. And I'm certainly not going to imply this is why Representative Winkler supported the change. I think he had a more complicated decision-making process than that. But the reality is this centralizes and consolidates power behind the speaker. I'll give you a perfect example. Last year on the Vikings Stadium bill, I was able to craft an amendment that made the Vikings pay $100 million more money, that forced the construction overruns, the cost overruns, to be the responsibility of the Vikings instead of the taxpayer, and then had the naming rights be shared between the public and the Vikings. We got over 95 votes for that amendment on the House floor. Now, if a 24-hour amendment rule was in place, I would have submitted that amendment, the lobbyists would have known about it, we never would have had a chance to do it. So it's one of the many reasons why this is a bad idea, but ultimately, in terms of its effect on the process, I mean, the Speaker has plenty of power, whether it's a Republican or Democrat, they have a lot of power. This is additional mechanism to consolidate and centralize power. It's a bad idea. Someday, I don't know when, but someday the Republicans will be in charge of the House of Representatives and will repeal that rule.
Great. I don't know that it really will make a difference one way or the other. I mean, the rules, the only real rule in the House of Representatives, just like the Senate, is majority rules. And everything else is sort of a guideline for the process. Fundamentally, the rules mean whatever the majority of the people there say they mean, and that was true under Republicans, and that's true under Democrats.
And
you know, the point is, if we don't have relationships that are good enough to be able to have a debate on the floor and offer amendments and work together to get the job done at the end of the day, it's not going to work, and it doesn't matter what the rules
The
are.
cold, unvarnished truth.
Well, I mean, the reality is bipartisanship primarily takes place in the conference committee process. When you have divided government, those are seen as negotiating points that enter conference committee.
Yeah.
Members of both sides are reluctant to trade away their bargaining positions in advance of sitting down at the table.
Exactly.
But the frustrating part for me is that for over 150 years, we've never had this limitation in place. And it is a little bit arrogant.
Do you know what the rules said in 1895?
No, but
neither do I.
No, actually, we talked to House staff, and they said they've. Now, granted, back in the 1800s, very few people spoke on the House floor. Offering amendments was a rare process. But if you look, this is, and it's one of the things that happens, and it happens to Republicans and Democrats. When one party has total control, there is a level of arrogance that takes place. And again, it's we haven't done it here before. It's a solution in search of a problem.
You just endorsed the IP in Minnesota.
Well, no, but I mean, it's and again, for me, I think it's a bad idea. I don't think it's a good idea. And I think this is one of these things. 4 years ago, there was something called the gag rule that they put time limits on debates.
I remember.
It's a great rule.
And it actually ended up prolonging the debates. And 2 years later, Republicans took charge and we repealed that rule.
And it didn't make any. Either way, it didn't really have any effect on the length of the debate, and that's the bottom line.
Yeah, it was just a completeless,
if the majority leader and the minority
fight.
leader can't walk across the room together and say much longer do you need, and when can we get to a vote, the place doesn't work. And you get to a point like we had in 2007 where the minority was trying to push us at the end of session so we couldn't pass bills, and push us to the point where we had to do things that hadn't been done very often before. But we have plenty of rules. If we want to shut off debate and move on, call a question, take a vote, we're done.
And at the end of session, it has been very common where when you've got 2 bills left and there's 4 hours left, the presiding officer can call for a vote. There's plenty of procedural tools at the speaker's disposal, but restricting amendments or requiring these amendments to be submitted in advance, it's unnecessary and it's ineffective. And I think it's sort of a sad commentary on some of the mindless fact-free debates we have here at the Capitol. And I mean, again, at some point in the future, it will be repealed. So it's just kind of embarrassing that we're even wasting time talking about it.
Well,
more uninteresting than embarrassing.
We're running out of time, so we're going to have to end this debate. But and I don't know, it may rage on like the LeBron and James and Michael Jordan. I don't know which of you is which, but we'll just leave it at that. And appreciate you coming on the program.
It's an honor to be on.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marty.
Thank you very much. And then we'd like to thank our guest, Ryan Winkler, and of course, Republican Pat Garofalo for being on the show tonight. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at MinCap News or on Facebook at Minnesota Capitol Conversations. If you send us a question, we ask it on the show. We really will ask it on the show, as we did tonight, and you can be entered into a contest to win a Nexus 7 tablet. What are those like, Garofalo? Are you
never touched one, don't know.
Are you a Mac or you're a PC guy?
No, I've got an iPhone, but I primarily use Windows products.
Yeah, and then did I already say don't forget to follow us on Twitter? Yeah. For more political news and analysis from the Capitol, tune in every morning to KFAI at 7:40 a.m. where I talk a little bit about politics here at the Capitol. We had production assistance tonight from Cliff Dahlberg. Our producer is Catherine Laudenslager. I'm Marty Owings. Paul Gardner couldn't be in tonight. He sometimes substitute co-hosts for us once in a while. Thanks for watching. We'll see you at the Capitol.